Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you. Welcome to Case Western Reserve University Siegal. My name is Alana Cooper, and I direct the Jewish Lifelong Learning program here. Great to have everyone here and to have our speaker here with us, who I will announce momentarily, give a proper introduction to momentarily. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about some of our upcoming programs. We have a number of exciting lectures coming up, starting with this Sunday. We have a lecture called Searching for Individuals in the International Tracing Service, which is one of the largest Holocaust archives in the world, and our speaker will be coming to us from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And this lecture is co-sponsored by ourselves and Kol Israel. It will be on Sunday in the afternoon at 2 p.m. from 2 to 3:30, but not here. Oh, and the Jewish Genealogical Society. Thank you, Brian. I'm glad you're back there. The lecture will not be held here. It's going to be at the Laurel School. If you're interested in attending and have not registered, want more information, please talk to me afterwards or to Cheryl and Brian. Next week, we're going to have on Monday and Tuesday, British historian Jonathan Schneer, who will be visiting from Atlanta. And I'm bringing him in because he has an award-winning book called The Balfour Declaration. And we are, of course, now 100 years since the Balfour Declaration is signed. And he will be giving a lecture called The Making of the Balfour Declaration, and his award-winning book will be on hand for purchase for those who are interested in getting a signed copy. So that's Monday evening here. If you have not registered and are interested, please make sure you register. We're sort of filling up near capacity with that lecture, and we're going to have to cap it at a certain number. So it is free for members of Lifelong Learning with a nominal fee of $5 for non-members. I'll take this opportunity to just note also, we urge everyone here to join, to become members of the Siegal Lifelong Learning Program. It helps us to have our membership list, and it's such a wonderful thing for us to be able to say that we have support of so many people in the community. Professor Schneer will also be speaking the following day on Tuesday morning. His talk is titled Ministers at War, Winston Churchill's Cabinet. That's not in our catalog. It is in our flyers. I think they're on your seats and scattered outside. Just two classes that are coming up that I want to draw your attention to coming up in November. On Tuesday evenings, the beginning of November, we have Herb Asherman who will be with us. He's a local photographer and founder of the Cleveland Photographic Workshop, and he'll be doing a mini-series on contemporary Jewish photographers. And towards the end of November, I'll be doing a course called The Jewish Calendar, Marking Holidays and Measuring Time, also on Tuesday evenings. Please be in touch with me if you want more information. If you have suggestions for lectures or courses, I'm always interested. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Alex Jassen, who just came in from New York. He serves as associate professor at New York University's Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies. Professor Jassen previously taught at the University of Minnesota, where he was the recipient of the university's prestigious McKnight Land Grant Fellowship. He holds a BA in Jewish Studies and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Washington and a PhD in Hebrew and Judaic Studies from New York University. He's published widely on the Dead Sea Scrolls and ancient Judaism, and is a member of the international editorial team that's responsible for the publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's the author of many academic works and books. I'll list some of the book titles for you so you have a sense of the breadth of his work. One is called Mediating the Divine, Prophecy and Revelation in the Dead Sea Scrolls and Second Temple Judaism, which was the winner of the 2009 John Templeton Award for Theological Promise. The author of Scripture and Law in the Dead Sea Scrolls, published in 2014, and co-editor of Scripture, Violence, and Textual Practice in Early Judaism and Christianity. In addition to his scholarly work, Dr. Jassen is also a popular lecturer. He's taught widely and lectured widely across the U.S. at synagogues, churches, museums, and community centers. And we're so happy to have you here in Cleveland. Please give him a warm welcome.
The images you saw a moment ago, of course, speak to some of the impact the Dead Sea Scrolls have in our modern day culture, which is part of what attracts us to these 2,000-year-old dusty, brittle manuscripts, from the fact that the former president of the United States goes to see them. I don't know how many total presidents or heads of state have gone to see exhibits, but this is the one that I could easily access, find a picture of. On the right, a prestigious publication highlighting the Dead Sea Scrolls. My guess is the Dead Sea Scrolls are the most frequently featured ancient Jewish manuscript in national media. They've been on the cover of the New York Times multiple times. And this is probably the only ancient Jewish text that has been in both Time magazine and the Weekly World News. If you read your headline carefully, you would have learned that the Dead Sea Scrolls predicted the Second Great Depression in 1999. This is, interestingly enough, just the tip of the iceberg. The Dead Sea Scrolls feature very frequently in all types of odd popular media. And as you're going to see in a moment, it has to do with the fact that these scrolls are these ancient collection of texts, 2,000 years old. They're written in a foreign language that most people don't understand. We'll talk about the languages in a moment. And therefore, they're mysterious, and rightfully so. Our task today is to unpack a little bit of the mystery, both why they show up on the cover of popular media, why they're so interesting beyond just the small world of the academic scholars who spend their lives with these things, but why they do, for good reasons, show up on the cover of these national magazines, and at the same time, why people have this peculiar fascination with them. Okay. We are going to start at the beginning. The story begins in 1947. With a Bedouin shepherd here on the right, a young man named Muhammad Adib, which means literally this is his nickname, Muhammad the Wolf. This is a picture of him as an older man when people went back and interviewed him about his experiences. Some of you may have heard this story before. The traditional version of the story is that he was out as a shepherd tending to his flock in the Judean desert, and I'll show you a map in a moment of where he was. And the story goes that one of the members of the flock went up into the hills, and I have no idea how shepherds do their work. I live in New York City. There are no shepherds nearby. But apparently, to kind of bring that member of the flock back, he threw a rock up, right? And when he threw that rock, it went into that nook you see here. Do I have a thing on here? I'm afraid to touch any button. Oh, here we go. You have a little nook here. And when he threw the rock in, it didn't make the sound that you would expect it to hear of hitting dirt or other rock. What it hit was a jar made out of pottery, earthenware, that looked like this. And the sound was peculiar. Now, the traditional version of the story is that Muhammad and his fellow shepherds were terrified because they heard a sound in the cave that they were not supposed to hear, and they suspected there were demons or some other, horrible creatures in there. They run home, they sleep on it, and they decide, it's worth it, because there's probably something special, some sort of treasure in there. Another version of the story, and of course, there are not that many eyewitnesses. This young man was actually interviewed, but we have no idea, how the story actually unfolded, and the story has grown a bit into a bit of a myth these days. One version of the story has it that this was not about running after a lost, member of the flock, but he was out there treasure hunting. And in fact, he was scouring all these caves because there were experiences of people doing treasure hunting in these caves and finding treasure, whether it be actual, gold and silver, or what he actually found was a different type of treasure, which were these incredible documents. When he goes back in there, he finds jars like this you see on the bottom left. And you can see up here on the top left what the cave looked like on the inside. It's not a very inviting space. And in fact, I'm going to show you here another picture. Oh. I shouldn't have touched a button. Oh, there we go. Okay. These are actually photos taken relatively recently of Qumran Cave 1, and I'll explain what Qumran is in a moment. And this is actually after the caves have been excavated a little by archaeologists, after they've been opened up so that scholars can get in there and dig around and find in every single nook and cranny any particular scroll that may be housed under a rock. Okay? But when Muhammad al-Adib found the scroll, found the cave initially, it was just a tiny little opening in the cave side. Right? Clearly these were scrolls that were put there for some reason not to be immediately found. And it took 2,000 years for anybody to find them, and in fact just by chance. To give you a sense of where we are, if you look here on the left, this is Jerusalem, and here you have the Dead Sea. The reason why these scrolls are called the Dead Sea Scrolls is because they are found near the Dead Sea, not because there's anything dead about them. And we'll see in a moment they're not really very many scrolls either. They're mostly little tattered fragments. Qumran, the site where the scrolls are found, is near Jericho, near Jerusalem, and a bit north of Ein-Gedi. If people have visited these sites, the sites of Ein-Gedi, Jericho, and Jerusalem are major, major important sites in this ancient time period. Jerusalem and Jericho being major urban centers, Ein-Gedi being the place, if you wanted to get the best balsam in ancient Israel, that's where you went. So Qumran is something of a crossroads between these ancient sites. The other places on this map are other places where scrolls and other ancient discoveries were found, some of which, most famously Masada, dating from a rebel stronghold in the 1st century and the revolt against the Romans. Other caves from a rebel holdout in the 2nd century CE, also against the Romans, the so-called Bar Kokhba revolt. What's of note here is that surrounding this area called Qumran are about 11 caves. There are hundreds of caves, but 11 caves over the years between 1947 when the first cave was found and 1956 when the 11th cave was found. These 11 caves were discovered, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Most of them are clustered around the site of Qumran. A few of them are a little bit of an outlier here, right? And one of the things we'll kind of keep coming back to a little bit tonight and a little bit tomorrow is who put these scrolls here and why? What was the purpose? Now, the storyline that initially were told as these scrolls came out of the caves and were reconstructed by historians is that, you know, in the emergence of the Romans in this war in the 1st century CE, this group of Jews hid their scrolls away. That is part of the picture, but we'll see it's a bit more complicated than that. There's a lot more going on behind the scenes here. Now, when Muhammad pulled those scrolls out of the caves, in the jars, he found 7 scrolls. The big question is, what does he do with them now? This Bedouin shepherd has no interest in the scrolls for their content at all. Remember, he was either deliberately treasure hunting or happened upon treasure. So he has to find a way to unload them to get a payoff. And here's where I'm going to introduce you to a rotating set of players that are interesting, full of intrigue, and a lot of drama, and a little bit of espionage in there too. We'll get to that. This wouldn't be the Dead Sea Scrolls without some sort of cloak and dagger situation. And I'm not exaggerating at all. We'll get to that. So the first set of players in our storyline, in the discovery and dissemination of the scrolls, are on the top left here, you see a man who's known by the name Kondo. Kondo was a cobbler who lived in Bethlehem. This was his kind of official business. But by actual practice, the way he made his money was he was an antiquities dealer. So the land of Israel at the time was just a place teeming with archaeological artifacts being dug out of the ground. There was no real control over this, no governmental control, right? And when people would find an artifact that they thought was of some value, they would bring it to somebody like Kondo and say, how much could you get me for this? And Kondo would strike a deal with whoever found it, and he'd act as the middleman. He'd take a cut, and then he'd go find his buyers. Now, incidentally, I don't know if anybody happened to see recently that there's been some articles in the news about recent Dead Sea Scrolls that were sold. And we'll come back to that because I want you to pay attention to the price that he sells them for. There were scrolls in the last decade or so, scrolls about the size of my hand sold for $100,000. Some of these scrolls are scrolls that Kondo wisely held back and gave to his children, who gave to their children, as investments. Other scrolls are modern day forgeries who are capitalizing on the incredible wealth that comes along with the Dead Sea Scrolls, where you can sell a tiny fragment for $100,000. But we can come back to that in a moment. So Kondo says, I'll be your middleman. And Kondo, being a Syrian Christian, goes to his Syrian metropolitan in Jerusalem, right? His clergy member, a man named Athanasius Yeshua Samuel, known as Mar Samuel. Because Kondo thought that the scrolls, which were written in Hebrew, we'll look at some images of them in a moment, he thought they were in an ancient language called Syriac, which is the language that Mar Samuel would have been familiar with. So he brought them to him for consultation. He wanted to get some kind of a fix on how much these things were worth and perhaps what their contents were and whether they were authentic after all. He brought him 4 scrolls. What we now know is the 4 scrolls that he brought him are a copy of the book of Isaiah, a copy of something called the Rule of the Community, a text that had never before been seen, a commentary on the prophetic book of Habakkuk, and something that scholars would later call the Genesis Apocryphon. That is a creative retelling of stories in the book of Genesis. We'll probably have an opportunity to look at some of these texts in more detail tomorrow. Now, I want you to pay attention to how much Mar Samuel buys the scrolls from Kondo for. $97.20. I don't know if that's the exchange rate, that's in the dollars compared to the Jordanian pounds back in the old days. But to put that in perspective, not only are Dead Sea Scrolls forgeries today going for $100,000, but a few years ago I was involved as an academic advisor for a Dead Sea Scrolls exhibition at a science museum. And the total cost of the entire production was $5 million. Right? So this is the deal of not just the century, the deal of a lifetime. Now, Mar Samuel recognizes right away that these scrolls are not in Syriac. He doesn't know what they are. He knows that they're in Hebrew. He's familiar enough with Hebrew to know that they're in Hebrew, but he has no idea what they are in actuality. Okay? So he buys them, but not to keep, and not for his own kind of educational purposes or not for his own kind of religious community, but he then says, I can get a higher price for these. We're going to come back to him in a moment. Remember, there were 7 scrolls. The other 3 scrolls made their way to another antiquities dealer who had bought those 3 scrolls for 7 Jordanian pounds, about $28. At the time, the Hebrew University was growing in size in the 1940s, and this man named Eliezer Sukenik, a professor and archaeologist at the Hebrew University, was tasked with the responsibility to build the antiquities collection. Sukenik's kind of daytime job was studying the archaeology of ancient synagogues, but because he was the archaeologist in-house, they told him, go find all the artifacts. So he learned about these scrolls, and he realizes that I want to go purchase them. He buys them. Okay? There's 3 scrolls that he purchases are another copy of Isaiah. There were 2 copies of Isaiah. The one that Mar Samuel had bought, if anybody's been to the Shrine of the Book in the Israel Museum, and you walk into that rotunda room and you see that scroll on display, that's the Isaiah scroll. It's not the actual Isaiah scroll. This is an exact replica. This is kind of a funny thing. Most of the scrolls you see on display there are the real thing, and they kind of rotate them out because of conservation reasons. But that scroll is a perfect replica, and we'll see an image of that in a moment. So a second copy of Isaiah, a scroll called the War Scroll. Anybody ever heard of the War Scroll? Not likely. This is, again, a one-of-a-kind scroll that describes an end-time battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. We'll meet the sons of light, and we'll also meet the sons of darkness as we go along. And another text known as the Thanksgiving Hymns. This is, again, a collection of writings from the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls that look a lot like our biblical psalms, that reflect kind of the ideology and the kind of beliefs and the anxieties and the hopes and the dreams of the members of this community. Now, I have Sukenik here alongside a picture of his son, who's probably the most famous of any of the people we're highlighting here among these players, a man named Yigael Yadin, who of course is famous for excavating the sites of Masada and Hatzor and many other ancient sites in Israel, and most famous as a statesman and member of the military. We will come back to Yadin in a moment. You can see this is a tangled web of characters that over time slowly begin to bring this collection together. So where we are now is Sukenik has purchased 3 of the scrolls on behalf of the Hebrew University in the state of Israel. Mar Samuel has 4 scrolls in his collection that he doesn't quite know what they are. He knows they're of some significance, but he doesn't know what to do with them. So he has to figure out, what are these things and how much value can I get for them? And you might say, well, why can't Sukenik and Mar Samuel pick up the phone and talk to each other? This is literally happening on the eve of war breaking out in the Middle East. In one of Sukenik's diaries, he actually talks about seeing one of these scrolls through a barbed wire fence, and I'm going to give you a clip of that in a moment. And this is like the day before the war is breaking out. And he can't go back to kind of finish the deal where he was eventually going to buy the other scrolls because war has broken out. So Mar Samuel calls in the experts. There is an institution in Jerusalem now called the Albright School, at the time called the American School of Oriental Research, where scholars who are interested in the archaeology of the Middle East go and spend a semester or a year in this site in Jerusalem, and they go, and there's one in Jordan, there's one in Egypt, there's places where they go and dig in these archaeological sites. So Mar Samuel realizes that maybe these are the experts. So he picks up the phone, and he calls imagine being there to pick up the phone. I have these scrolls, I don't know what they are, they're pretty old, I think. Now, as it happened, the boss at the time, a professor from Yale University, an eminent scholar of the Bible, happened to be out of town. So the two young, fresh guys there that were there on their kind of postdocs, sabbaticals, didn't even have an academic position yet, happened to pick up the phone. And this changed it. They would have almost no kind of scholarly record were it not for the fact that they happened to be at the right place at the right time. And these are two men named William Brownlee that you can see in the bottom picture, and John Trevor in the top right. Now, both of them have different roles in the scholarly dissemination of the scrolls. But for our purposes, one of the most important things that they did is, first of all, make this connection with Mar Samuel. And they figured out what the 4 scrolls were, right? John Trevor talks about in his diaries opening up the scroll of Isaiah and copying some of it out, and then going into his Bible and looking it up in a concordance and realizing, oh my God, this is a copy of Isaiah. I don't know how old it is, but it's a copy of Isaiah. The other thing about Trevor, and you can see here in the picture on the top right, is he was an accomplished photographer. He was probably a better photographer than he was a Bible scholar. And he also has these remarkable stories he tells of trying to photograph the scrolls in the late 1940s, right? There's been a lag time here, right? Again, on the eve of war breaking out, he has to run around town trying to find film to purchase, right? The electricity is kicking off frequently because of the fact that Jerusalem is kind of in not quite stable, right? Now John Trevor and William Brownlee, copy out some of one of the scrolls. And they send it in the mail, not the scroll itself, but they copy it out. Mar Samuel's still in ownership of the scrolls. They copy out a fragment, right, in perfect kind of copying of the handwriting style, and send it to their teacher, a guy named William F. Albright, who is most famous for being kind of the dean of the study of the Hebrew Bible and archaeology in America. He trained many of the famous Israeli archaeologists in the early part of the 20th century. And I want to read his response, because you really get a sense, you get kind of drawn into, scholars have this kind of reputation of being kind of very soft-spoken, not really getting excited about things. But listen what Albright has to say when he writes back to Trevor and Brownlee. Your air letter of February 25th, with its enclosures, arrived this morning, and I immediately got out my magnifying glass and started in. My heartiest congratulations on the greatest manuscript discovery in modern times. And here's where I think, you really see Albright's kind of humanity coming out in spite of his really kind of soft-spoken academic demeanor. You can imagine how my eyes bulged, right? Look at him on the right. These clearly is not a man whose eyes bulge out very often. When I saw the script through my magnifying glass, what an absolutely incredible find. And there can happily not be the slightest doubt in the world about the genuineness of the MS as an abbreviation for manuscript. Now, the reason why Albright in particular points out this issue of the genuineness is when the scrolls were first brought out and they started to be brought out to the academic community, there was a lot of skepticism about their authenticity, right? Just like now, in the last decade or so, out of the dozen or so Dead Sea Scrolls fragments that have been sold to various institutions, probably 10 out of those 12 are modern forgeries. Somebody with a careful precision and a lot of time and skill on their hands forged these documents. This was a commonplace in the early part of the 20th century. And Albright and others were kind of on the lookout for this. Right? Now, how did Albright and others, in particular Sukenik, know that these were ancient texts? And here we go back to Eliezer Sukenik, the professor from Hebrew University. Unlike Trevor, who when he saw a copy of Isaiah had to open up his biblical concordance to figure out what this was, Sukenik looked at these scrolls right away and he knew this was a copy of Isaiah. But the question in his mind was, how old are these? And here we get again an accounting. This is an account by John Trevor having interviewed Sukenik. And we hear the following highly dramatized description of Sukenik seeing the scrolls. Through the barbed wire barricade, remember this is partitioned Jerusalem, the eminent archaeologist, that is Eliezer Sukenik, saw a ragged fragment of leather inscribed in strange Hebrew characters. When Sukenik noticed a resemblance between the script on the fragment and that which had been seen scratched on first century ossuaries, his initial skepticism soon gave way to excited curiosity. Now, what's an ossuary? Why did that help Sukenik? An ossuary is something you see on the right. It's literally a bone box. In the first century, BC and CE, Jews in the land of Israel who were of higher means, of higher social status and higher means, had a particular way of burying their family members. They would leave the body to decompose in a tomb. And once the body had decomposed, they would take the bones and put it into a box that looked like this. Okay? There are plenty of examples of burial in the ground, right? And that tended to be among the lower classes who could not afford a family tomb. And these bone boxes, which had the bones of family members that were then put into family tombs, oftentimes were inscribed with the name of the individual, oftentimes with some moniker of what they did, their profession, kind of like a tombstone today, or a tombstone for the last thousands of years. And you can see here on the right there is also a tombstone here. Ossuary, a bone box with an inscription. So the handwriting style of the scribes who would write this is not like any old person writes on the bone box. Just like nowadays, you hire a professional to prepare a tombstone. In antiquity, you hired a professional for any type of writing. And those professionals were trained in the scribal practices and handwriting styles. And Sukenik noticed right away that the style of the script on these scrolls was very similar to the style of the script on the first century CE bone boxes, right? And it would be the same way that if you looked at a letter, let's say written by somebody from the early part of the 20th century versus a letter written by somebody in the early part of the 21st century, you would know right away, because first of all, penmanship would be much better. Probably it would be written in cursive if it was part of the early part of the 20th century. Maybe somebody in the 21st century, especially a younger person, would have no idea how to actually write a formal letter, right? You can pinpoint the time frame in which something is written by the style of writing. And that's especially the case when the people writing are a tiny sliver of the population. Okay? So where we've now brought ourselves, by the end of the 1940s, Eliezer Sukenik and other scholars have determined that these scrolls are authentic. They are old. They've identified the 7 scrolls. In fact, all 7 of these scrolls by the early 1950s were published and disseminated into the academic world and in the general public. They were on the cover of the New York Times, on the cover of Time magazine. For all of the talk over the years, and you've probably heard this, that most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were not published until the 1990s. The first 7 Dead Sea Scrolls were widely available very, very early. Okay. But remember, Mar Samuel still has those 4 scrolls. And he doesn't want them for his collection. He wants to make a few bucks off of them. Okay. And remember now the scrolls have become, he was smart to hold on to them even if that was not by design, because now the value of the scrolls has jumped up quite a bit, because now everybody sees what they are, they see that they're authentic. But he can't find a buyer. He can't find a buyer in Jerusalem. So he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take my scrolls on the road. I'm going to go to America. So he has his contacts in America, set up a lecture series. He goes to all the different universities, and he's talking about his experiences with the scrolls, and he's putting them on display, right? Unlike nowadays, if those of you who have been to the Israel Museum or been to an exhibit, you don't get much access to them. The tour that Mar Samuel took, he owns the scrolls, right? So he's putting them on a table. He's showing the university officials, the members of the board of trustees, his great artifacts, trying to find a buyer. He can't find a buyer, right? So what does he do? What do we do when we're trying to unload something when we can't find anything? We put an ad in Craigslist or something else. He puts an ad in the paper, right? Back when people actually put ads in papers. He puts an ad in the Wall Street Journal. June 1st, 1954, Miscellaneous for sale. The 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC, are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational religious institution by an individual or group. Box F206, The Wall Street Journal. Now, at the time, Yigael Yadin, Sukenik's son, had been on a lecture tour of the United States also, and somebody alerted him to this. Now, this is kind of part of Yadin's kind of legacy to his father, because Sukenik had actually seen those 4 scrolls. He had a clandestine meeting with one of Mar Samuel's people, and then there started to initiate the process of buying the scrolls on behalf of the Hebrew University, and then war breaks out, and the trail goes dead. Sukenik dies. He goes to his grave thinking that this is the great loss of his life, that he was not able to get these scrolls and to bring them back together. So his son is able to do this, but here's where the espionage and the cloak and dagger comes in. Mar Samuel would not have any dealings with the Israeli government, nor with Yigael Yadin, right? And vice versa, because of political issues. So what Yadin does is he enlists the help of a colleague of his, Harry Orlinsky, who's a professor at the Hebrew Union College in New York. Orlinsky acts as just an interested person. He literally answers the ad and says, "I'd like to see these." They set up a meeting in a bank vault in Manhattan. Orlinsky goes in, right? This is actually, if you look up Orlinsky's obituary in the New York Times, this is one of the things that's highlighted. He goes in under cover of a different identity, looks at the scrolls, authenticates them, walks out. He's got a code word. He picks up the phone and calls whoever Yadin or his contact, and gives them the code word and says they're the real deal. They broker a deal for $250,000. Again, the price has gone way up. So again, Mar Samuel makes quite a buck. If he had held on to them, he probably would have gotten better return on his investment. But for $250,000, Yadin buys them on behalf of the State of Israel. And then all 7 original scrolls now become owned by the modern State of Israel. And then Israel builds the Shrine of the Book within the Israel Museum. Now, by 1954, the price had gone up not just because of those 7 scrolls that were found in Cave 1, but as soon as those first scrolls were brought out into the academic world, you can imagine what the scholars were doing. Albright's eyes were bulging seeing one scroll. You can imagine all the other scholars salivating at the prospect that there were ancient manuscripts in the Judean desert, ancient Jewish manuscripts. Scrolls have been found in Egypt. They have been found in Italy. They have been found in all of the places in the Mediterranean. But scholars had always thought that the climate in the land of Israel was not conducive to preserving ancient manuscripts. They were clearly wrong. What happened was 2 people get together. A man named Lancaster Harding, who was the director of antiquities in Jordan, because the Judean desert at the time was under the authority of the Jordanian kingdom at the time, and he enlists the help of a scholar named Roland Deveau, who is a Bible scholar at the École Biblique, which is a French biblical and archaeological school in Jerusalem. Now, this is the only picture I have of Harding without a cigarette in his mouth, and you'll see why that's important in a moment. And what they do is they get a team of archaeologists and scholars together to go scour every single nook and cranny in the Judean desert. Okay? You can see here on the left, every one of those dots is a crevice that they excavate. 300 or so in total. Okay? Now, of course, the terrain and the topography of the site has changed considerably over the years, but they dig and dig. Now, the Bedouin tribe, who found the initial scrolls, right, that young man who in dialogue with his tribe does the brokering with Kondo, they also realize that they have treasure buried out there. So they go out looking for scrolls. So from 1947 onward, it's a race. Now again, you can imagine, here I'll show you the picture of Harding and Deveau, these 2 gentlemen, clearly very distinguished scholars, versus the Bedouin who live in this terrain. You can imagine that it's kind of an unfair race here. The Bedouin find scrolls in 1952. They find 3 caves, caves 2, 4, and 6. You can see them here again on the map here. 2, 11, 1, 2, sorry, that's 3, 11, 1, 2. So here's cave 1. Cave 2 is found very close nearby. And it takes several years before they find these things. So they're digging in every single nook and cranny. In 1952, the scholars get a consolation prize of cave 3 and 5. 1955, other scrolls caves are found by archaeologists. In 1956, the last cave, cave 11, is found. Now, the reason why I mention this is because the main rule of archaeology is to find something on the actual site. Provenance is important. Number 1, it tells you that it's authentic. And number 2, you get to know, you can trace where it came from, where the collections go together. Okay? To give you an example of this, Cave 3, which was found by the archaeologists, had a very peculiar scroll in it, known as the copper scroll. This is the only scroll in the entire collection inscribed on copper. The letters are actually etched into the plates of copper. And this is important because the scroll describes a treasure map of sorts. It describes 64 sites throughout the land of Israel where buried treasures found massive amounts of gold and silver. It's not like, you know, go down this highway and turn left and, you know, go off this exit. It's in this kind of cryptic language like, you know, go 6 cubits past the cold chamber, dig down, you know, through the 3-forked, you know, tree, and you'll find, you know, 20 talents of gold and silver, right? This is a peculiar scroll because it probably represents some connection to the treasury of the Jerusalem temple, which is quite unique because the people associated with the other scrolls in the other caves seem to have a deep hatred of the priests in the Jerusalem temple. So the fact that scholars found this in its original context suggests that it may not be related to the other scrolls. In fact, there were very few other scrolls found in Cave 3, none of them that reflect the same kind of worldview of the community in the other caves, right? Other interesting caves, they're all interesting, of course, but Cave 7 is interesting because there were a couple dozen scrolls found that are all in Greek, right? Some translations of the Bible into Greek. Here you have a jar on the right, which probably held some sort of liquid, maybe wine, that has in Aramaic or possibly Hebrew the word Roma, which means Rome. Just to give you a sense of what we're seeing here, so here's Cave 10 and Cave 11. Again, not very hospitable, inviting terrain. You can see why the archaeologists didn't find many of these things. Cave 11 found by the Bedouin. These are some recent pictures taken here. But the prize of all these caves is Cave 4. Carved into the side of a mountaintop. Very inaccessible. And you can see here, whereas Cave 1, the picture we saw a moment ago, very uninviting, you can see Cave 4 is clearly a human-created cave. People went in and dug out the soft limestone, made a nice level ground, made 2 separate chambers. You can see there's holes in the wall. There probably were some sort of shelving system in here where the scrolls would have been shelved in the cave. Okay? What scholars found, well, scholars didn't find this, but what scholars got from the Bedouin was about 15,000 pieces of scrolls. Okay? So again, put that in perspective. What you're talking about here is somebody comes up to you and says, I have 15,000 pieces. They're in terrible shape. For years and years, rats have been chewing on them for their dinner. Bats have been sitting on, on the top, going to the bathroom on them. They've deteriorated over time. And then these scholars have been told, hey, put these back together. Right? So again, when the scholars did put them back together, they figured out there were about 550 original manuscripts in that cave. So again, that's the equivalent of going and taking 550 jigsaw puzzles, putting them all in one pile, taking about 90% of the pieces out of the pile, and then just doing everything you can to make them physically deteriorate, and then saying, put the jigsaw puzzles back together. And in many cases, without the picture on the cover to guide you, right? We'll talk about that in a moment. They found other things in caves. They found fasteners, tabs on the left here. They found phylacteries, tefillin. They found baskets. Some of the caves, especially Cave 4, had evidence of inhabitation, that people were living there. So once the scrolls were discovered and all these scrolls started to come out in the 1950s, there were 2 tasks ahead of the scholars. And we're going to talk about those 2 tonight, and then we're going to get a bit more into the scrolls themselves tomorrow. The first task was to do that jigsaw puzzle work, to put them back together. The second task, is that for us, was to find this nearby settlement known as Qumran and figure out what it had to do with the scrolls themselves. Okay? Not too far away from the 11 caves, in case of most of the caves, about 8 of them, clustered in a circle around this settlement known as Qumran. Qumran was a site that had been inhabited, had been known about for many years. Scholars once upon a time thought it was the biblical site of Gomorrah because of its proximity to the Dead Sea, but it kind of attracted no attention from archaeologists until all of a sudden they started pulling these scrolls out of caves in the nearby vicinity. Harding, DeVoe, and Millick, right, you can see here Harding has a cigarette in his mouth. They begin excavating this site. Okay? And their goal was to try to make sense of what the connection of the site is to the scrolls that were found nearby. There were no scrolls found on the site, and that's not surprising because the site shows evidence of having been burned at the end of the 1st century CE. Right? The fact that there are arrowheads in the style that the Roman armies would have used indicates that the Romans came there probably on their way to Jerusalem to destroy Jerusalem and burn the site on the way. Now, you can see here what the site looked like in its heyday in the 1st century BCE. These pictures are actually a reverse image, right? On the map on the right, the top is north and the bottom is south. On the other side, it's flipped around. And you can see here, I want to call attention to, there's lots of things we could call attention to, but I want to call attention to 2 things in particular. On the right, you can see every place where there is blue is water. Okay. Now, when I see this much water in a desert site, I think of 2 things. Number 1, where do they get that water from? And number 2, what do they do with all that water? If you're in a site in the desert and you have a precious commodity, a scarce resource of water, do you really need that much water? Right? The other thing I want to call your attention to, and we're going to come back to this in a moment, is the largest space here, the largest indoor space, which is right here. This is the so-called room 77. Now, to answer the first question of where they got the water from, let's see if this is going to work. This is how water comes in the desert. This is a flash flood. You'd be surprised how many videos you can find of YouTube of flash floods in the Judean desert. You can see there's massive rain coming down and flowing into the different areas. Right? Way off the mountainsides, it's flowing down these channels. And the goal, of course, is to harness this water. These flash floods happen very infrequently in the Judean desert. You have to find a way to capture that water when you can. So this site has a very sophisticated system of aqueducts that would bring water into cisterns and into ritual baths, into mikvaot. Now, the reason why this is so important is because the significance of that abundance of water is not because they had needed to drink so much water, right? People didn't really drink water in Antiquity. They used it for bathing and for cooking. And you don't need that much water for such a small site. But if you're engaged in the kind of obsessive practice of ritual bathing, if you're obsessed with purity regulations, as some groups of Jews were in this ancient time period, then you need a lot of water. Right? In particular, many of those water sources, especially the ritual baths, are right next to that room I highlighted a moment ago, that room 77, which you can see here in its nowadays, if you go visit Qumran, which is a very large room, 72 feet by 15 feet, which most scholars assume is a communal eating hall, like a mess hall. Right? This is essentially a community that lived together, ate together, and probably obsessively engaged in ritual bathing a lot. And in particular, probably before they went into this room to go eat. So we're starting to see some unique kind of profile of this community. A sectarian community that lives a certain way of Judaism. Okay? Now, the reason also why we know this is a communal eating hall is because right next door we found a bunch of pots, pans, cookingware, right? Eatingware. So, the site's excavated, it's identified as having this sectarian character, but we still haven't quite put back those jigsaw puzzles of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And here I'm going to walk you through some of the scrolls to see how we went from those initial Cave 1 scrolls to the fragments that got reconstructed that we're going to see in a moment. Here we have this famous Isaiah scroll from Cave 1. This is an anomaly in the sense that this looks like a modern-day Torah scroll, just a little tattered around the edges, right? This is not what most of the Dead Sea Scrolls look like. Most of them really should be Dead Sea fragments. This is a really good, nicely preserved scroll. Right? This is the Thanksgiving hymns from Cave 1. That man there is not a Dead Sea Scroll scholar. He's a person who worked with the reconstruction of material remains. He's trying to peel apart the scroll without pulling off the ink off the parchment. It gets better. This is a copy of what's known as the Temple Scroll from Cave 11. The Temple Scroll has a fascinating story behind it. In the 1960s, after this was discovered by the Bedouin in Cave 11 and they brought it to Kondo, Kondo enlisted the help of a middleman to go bring it to the attention of Yadin, or the person we met a moment ago. And this American pastor acts as a middleman. He teases the scroll to Yadin. Yadin says, yes, I want to see a piece of this. So he gives them some money, tens of thousands of dollars to see this little fragment here. This piece here that you see on the right, this is how it was sent to him in the mail. Some postage stamps licked and then put together to hold the pieces together and then sent in the regular mail, right? The epilogue to this story is that that trail runs cold. And Yadin, in the 1967 war, when he's in the military, he realizes once Israel has taken control of the West Bank, he gets a jeep, gets some MPs, and hops on the way to Bethlehem to go find Kondo and says, I know what you have. I want that scroll that you teased to me all those years ago that I never got. Kondo says, no, I don't have it. He ends up pulling up the floorboards of his house, pulls out an old cigar box with the scroll in there. Now, if you see the temple scroll all rolled out, you see there's this interesting kind of pattern of deterioration. What that's from is that all those years from 1956 to 1967, when they were mopping the floor in Kondo's house, the floorboards have a clear kind of opening, and the water is dripping down in 10 years, yes. The temple scroll is still a remarkable scroll, notwithstanding those damage patterns. This is what most of the Dead Sea Scrolls look like. This is a reconstructed Dead Sea Scroll. A scroll from Cave 1 where they're putting the jigsaw puzzle back together with almost nothing to actually work with. This is a text that had never been seen before. So again, they're working without the advantage of the cover. Right here you see an image of the scholars working. This is the room in the Rockefeller Museum, then the Palestine Archaeological Museum, where they worked on these scrolls. And when they would put them back together, they would put them between these glass plates. Here you can see another kind of image of the process. This is the curator of the museum up on the upper right. And you can see there's two different things going on there. In some cases, he just has boxes where he has fragment pieces. And then once the scholars were able to put the things back together in a reasonable kind of sense of how they all went back together, they would put them between glass plates, right? Sometimes they would actually attach them with Scotch tape, right? Which is just remarkable in kind of the conflict between these scholars who are kind of in a race to figure out what's in them with no sense of conservation, right? Now, the reason why I mention that in particular is because once those scrolls were put into those glass plates, they started taking pictures. Just like Trevor is most important to our story because of the photographs he takes of the Cave 1 scrolls, there was a photographer-in-chief of the Palestine Archaeological Museum, Najib Albina, who in this picture right here is with his brother and another colleague actually developing motion picture film in Jerusalem. He takes these incredible pictures. And many of his pictures show the scrolls in a state of preservation much better than we have them today. Right? I've gone to see the scrolls in the Israel Museum today, and they do good work now conserving them. But they had years and years in the caves. In fact, the couple decades they were out of the caves, the scrolls deteriorated far worse than in the 2 years because of things like this. Natural light coming in, right? Cigarettes, right? Like I told you, we only had one picture of Harding without a cigarette. To put that in perspective, look what we have here. This is a modern conservator of the Israel Antiquities Authority working with little tweezers, right? Now, when I've gone to work on the scrolls, they take you into a room in the basement, there's no natural light, and they tell you, don't touch it, don't move it, just look at it, right? And in fact, in many cases, those photographs from the early years show the scrolls in a much better state. Now, we've talked about the discovery, we've talked about the site of Qumran, we've talked about the reconstruction. What have we not talked about? What's in them, right? I will tease you a little bit, but I'm going to leave you on a little cliffhanger. Apologies to those who are not coming tomorrow. But here's what I wanted to say very briefly. Just a general bird's eye view, because I want to make sure we have some time for questions. What's in these scrolls? When the scholars got done with their work of putting the jigsaw puzzles back together, they found out that there were about 931 original manuscripts. So again, keep that in mind. The manuscript means that in those caves, what was originally a rolled up scroll, there were about 930 of those. In many cases, there were multiple copies of the same text, right? So there's 30 copies of the book of Deuteronomy, for example, right? That counts as 30 in that 930 count. The languages, there's 80% of them are in Hebrew, 15% or so in Aramaic, and 5% or so in Greek. This is interesting because the spoken language in this time period was not Hebrew, it was Aramaic, right? So they're writing in this kind of heritage language. They're also writing primarily on animal skin, which I don't know if anybody here has ever purchased an animal skin to write on. It's very expensive and very labor intensive, as opposed to papyrus, which is an ancient form of paper, which is easier to procure, much cheaper, right? All of the texts in this collection are what I would call religious in nature. They reflect the literary imagination of people. We're going to see this over the course of our talk tomorrow. There are books of what we now call the Bible, works of law, speculation on the end of days, works of speculative wisdom. There's very little, almost no content that reflects what we would think of as the mundane day-to-day aspects of life. Deeds, receipts, marriage contracts, or things of that nature. So there's something very purposeful about this collection, right? These were put in these 11 caves. There were specific texts that were chosen, presumably, because it's not just a haphazard collection of texts. Otherwise, we would expect to find a marriage contract in there, as we find, for example, in the scrolls at Masada or in the 2nd century CE, where the rebels in the Bar Kokhba revolt hit out, where you have this kind of combination of literary and documentary texts. A very distinct part of this collection reflects the ideology and the identity of a particular community, right? Hence the name, the rule of the community, for one of their major documents. I heard somebody just whisper the Essenes. We will get to the Essenes, I promise you. But also, this is presumably the community that lived at this site of Qumran, the ones that were obsessed with ritual bathing, that ate meals together. When do these scrolls come from? The scrolls themselves date to different time periods. And here we have to distinguish between the date a text was composed, the date a text was copied, and the date a text was put into the caves. The easiest thing to determine here is the composition, the copying of the scrolls, right? When was in any particular manuscript copied, right? So if it's a book of Genesis, right? We don't know when it was actually written. It's written way back in the old days, right? Or if it's something like the rule of the community, which we had never seen before, we can speculate on the dating of when the text was composed based on, factors that are internal, maybe historical references. But these scrolls were all copied between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. The overwhelming majority of them in the 2nd and 1st century BCE. And they were probably put into the caves around the 1st century CE. Now, how do we know that dating of the copying? Number one, hard science like carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 was very new in the 1950s when these scrolls were discovered. It required destroying a large amount of material. In fact, what they would do is they would cut off part of the scroll or the fragment that had no inscribed text, and they would send it to the scientist, and they'd do the carbon-14. But the more successful way of dating the scrolls was a science known as paleography. Paleography is, very simply put, analyzing the style of the script, like we saw Sukenik do a moment ago when he looked at the bone box and knew these were from the 1st century. When they take these two techniques together, and here I've given you one example from the Cave 1 Thanksgiving hymns, they're really close, right? The kind of soft science of scholars kind of estimating when this handwriting style comes from, because they look at the handwriting style and they compare it to handwriting styles from those professional scribes where the text is dated, because like a receipt or a 1st century ossuary, we know when it's dated, and they can line them up. And lo and behold, most of the carbon-14 dating lines up very nicely. And I want to give you a sense of what these scripts look like. Even people who know no Hebrew, right? I teach about the Dead Sea Scrolls all over the place. People who know Hebrew quite well. Some of you in this room probably can look at, especially the one in the middle with this nice, clear handwriting, and decipher some of these words or some of the letters. But even knowing no Hebrew, you can see right away the differences. In fact, when these are compared, when they're lined up with other known scrolls and writing, you can see here on the top is a script from the late 2nd century BC. The one in the middle, this is the copy of Isaiah, by the way. In the middle, you have a copy of the book of Daniel from the 1st century BC. On the bottom, you have this very peculiar thing where you have a Hebrew scroll of Leviticus written not in the Hebrew that becomes the standard Hebrew from about the 6th century BC onward, but the so-called Paleo-Hebrew, the Hebrew that ancient Israelites would have written in before the 6th century BC. You also have this peculiar feature where the scroll is written in the standard kind of so-called Aramaic script of Hebrew. And then does anybody notice anything unique in that scroll on the top? You don't have to know Hebrew to know this. The one word all of a sudden changes. Does anybody know what that is? Who knows their Paleo Hebrew here? You didn't know there was homework you were supposed to prepare. That is Yud He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton. So this text, which we're going to come back to tomorrow, is a commentary on the prophet Habakkuk. You notice, of course, it's a very nicely prepared manuscript. There's lines incised in the text, and the letters hang from the lines, right? And the scribe, when he got to the name of God, changed the script to the ancient script. Now, I've gone both ways on how to understand this, either as a way to kind of mark for a reader who maybe doesn't even know the language that this is unique and special. This is, the name of God, so therefore we're going to go in the ancient language. Or it makes the name of God even more mysterious because it's in the script that nobody knows. Even educated scribes, even the very few people that are literate in this time period, would potentially not know what that is. Right? What's the thing on the bottom? If you're baffled, you should be. This is, in my mind, one of the most interesting aspects of the script of the scrolls. This is a cryptic script. You can see here, what does that look like? A B. It is a B. I mean, it's a Greek letter. You can see some Paleo-Hebrew letters here. You can see a later Aramaic Hebrew Lamed. You can see and then you can see these weird markings that have nothing to do with anything. And by the way, also it's read from left to right. This is a horoscope text. And the reason why it's in a cryptic script is because it's secret knowledge. And there are quite a few of these secret texts that are written in these cryptic scripts. Right? Through this process, they were able to kind of map out the entirety of kind of the profile of these scrolls, give every single scroll a precise dating. Where we've come to now is we've discovered the scrolls, we've met this kind of cast of characters full of intrigue and drama and scholars with eyes bulging out. We've met the site of Qumran where these people probably lived. We've seen some of the peculiar features like the abundance of water, the communal eating hall. We've seen the process of reconstructing the scrolls from the nicely already in one-piece scrolls like the Isaiah scroll to those ones that are in the tiny fragments, brought them all together. We've begun the process of trying to figure out what's in these scrolls, and we will continue that process tomorrow by talking a bit about who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Right, this is like the second half of the title. What are the Dead Sea Scrolls we've kind of got to? We've begun to talk about why they're so important, but the real response to why they're so important is going to take place tomorrow when we talk about who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, why they wrote them, why they ended up in the caves, and why are they so interesting. Thank you for your time. I welcome you to ask questions.
Okay, I will, if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll get the mic around the room. I'm going to start in the back.
I can also go back to some of the other pictures. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Sure. I don't think this is on, is it?
I think it's on. Okay. I can hear you.
Several questions.
Sure.
What is the percentage of the Dead Sea Scrolls that are literally papyrus as opposed to leather?
Papyrus is I have it up here, I think on the slide, right?
Because
I skipped over that one paragraph. 80%, oh no, I didn't give you the number. 80% are in animal skin. I guess the copper scroll would be like 0.001% because right. I don't know the math exactly. So I would say approximately 20% are in papyrus, which is very unique.
Yeah. Because
papyrus is inexpensive to produce. It's terrible for preservation. We're really happy that they wrote mostly on animal skin. But again, to kind of think about something we're going to talk about tomorrow, the identity of this community. Most scholars think it's this group known as the Essenes, who lived a very ascetic lifestyle. They shunned material wealth, as far as we know from ancient historians, but yet they are writing their scrolls on a product which is very labor-intensive and requires a great deal of resources to produce. Copper. The copper scroll is just remarkable because of both the writing surface and because of its content. Like I mentioned, it's a treasure map. And my particular understanding of the copper scroll is it probably was not associated with this community. It probably was put into the caves in the 1st century CE. Probably these caves were known to be places where people stored scrolls. And probably with the emergence of the Romans to kind of come destroy Jerusalem, somebody kind of ran away and put the copper scroll there.
So, room 77.
Yes. That's a great question. We will talk about this a little bit tomorrow. The evidence is unclear as to whether there were even women at the site. The textual evidence is equivocal. Some texts describe a community with families, women and children, and some texts, like this thing called the Rule of the Community, have no sense of a life lived with families. It seems to be a rule text for kind of a hardcore sectarian movement of men who probably lived a celibate lifestyle. And we know that the Essenes are described as celibate from some of our ancient writers. Right? But we'll come back to that a little bit tomorrow. I'm going to let Alana take the mic where it needs to go so everybody can hear.
So are you saying that the mikveh that you showed the picture of and currently is associated with female use at that time was associated primarily with male use?
Yes. This is an interesting kind of shift in Jewish ritual practice. In antiquity, people who did ritual bathing were initially those who had some association with the temple in Jerusalem. Because in order to enter into the sacred precinct of the temple, according to the Levitical laws of Leviticus and as they're understood by later Judaism, you have to be in a state of ritual purity. Those who were officiating in the temple were men, priests, and Levites. Those were the ones for whom ritual purity was created. Beginning in this time period known as the Second Temple period, about the 2nd or 1st century BCE, we start to see evidence of a more widespread interest among the average Jew, right? Probably the elite Jew who has access to these types of things, wanting to live the life like a priest for a variety of reasons, probably to kind of democratize religious experience and try to have more access to God, not through the intermediary of the temple and the priests. And they begin to take on some of these requirements of ritual purity, right? And this is primarily something that happens among men, right? It's only much later that the process of ritual purification is also expanded to women. And now this does grow out of the sources of kind of ritual taboos associated with things like blood in the book of Leviticus, right? But women in this time period, as far as we can tell, were not frequently engaging in this ritual bathing because the notion of having ritual purity among the non-priests was just not a thing. It was the priests who had to engage in the ritual purity. So to respond to your question even more so, it's not just that the gender dynamics have changed over time. The very nature of who is engaged in the process of ritual immersion changes. And that's why this particular community is so unique. To put it in perspective, that abundance of water, all those blue spots, if you go to villages around Jerusalem and the Galilee, places that have been excavated, you have huge villages, and huge I mean by relative terms, where there's like one ritual bath, right? So it's a slowly emerging tradition. So these people, which were probably a group of disenfranchised priests, so they're people out of the temple trying to live the life of the priests in the temple world, are very unique in the landscape of ancient Judaism in that sense.
Thank you. My hearing is not that great, but how different was the Hebrew 200 BC from today's Hebrew?
You mean modern Hebrew spoken in Israel?
Yes.
The Hebrew is dramatically different.
What?
Very, very different. So an Israeli could probably pick up one of these scrolls and could probably decipher a lot of it. But there are considerable differences in vocabulary, right? They didn't have a word for recycle 2,000 years ago, right? They didn't have a word for a computer. The grammatical structure is different. Some Israelis can, of course, pick up the Bible and read it with ease. Some have a harder time. But like all languages, if you open up Canterbury Tales and read it in the Middle English, it's very hard to decipher for us, right? The script, of course, is relatively unchanged. You can see here from, I went back here. Yeah, you can see here from the script, this is very close to the script that modern Hebrew is written in. Yes?
Any dating coinage?
Yeah, that's actually how they know. Oh, the question is whether the coins play a part in the dating. There were no coins found in the caves among the scrolls. There was an abundance of coins found at the site of Qumran. And coins are archaeologists' best friend. Because if you think of the way that archaeologists do their work, right? They basically churn the ground upside down, and they start figuring out the layers of civilization. But nobody puts like a peg in the ground and says, okay, now we're in 100 BCE, right? Now we're in 50 BC. You have to find those layers. And because nowadays, of course, we bulldoze something and we kind of build anew, they just built on top of one another. So when you had a layer of civilization, the way that you dated that layer is oftentimes by all the coins, the spare change that fell out of people's pockets, so to speak. And the coins in this time period are associated with various kings. Either Hasmonean kings, right? For example, the 2nd century BC, you have the descendants of the Maccabees who become the kings in Jerusalem, and they mint coinage. So they found this coinage, and they can that's how they know these layers of the sites, of the civilization layers.
Any inscriptions on the coins that they found?
Yeah, the coins are classical coins associated with the Hasmonean kings, like so-and-so, King Yonatan, Melech, Yisrael, right? After 70 CE, the site was destroyed, as I mentioned, by the Romans. We have Roman coinage there, right?
Nothing in between.
Well, you have some of the Jewish coins as well from the revolt in the 1st century. Every single layer has its own coinage.
I have. Can you?
We can talk more about coins. Yeah.
I have two questions separated by 2,000 years.
That's okay.
The first one is, do you have the name of the guy who answered the ad in the Wall Street Journal? It's a famous name.
That's a great question. You mean like who actually picked up the phone? I don't know.
Somebody did.
Well, I don't know exactly who called. That's a good question. I have to check on that. I don't know. If there's probably a record of that somewhere. This was Yadin and Orlinsky conspiring together.
I remember the name Glass. Something.
I'll check on that. It's possible.
The other question is there any evidence that the Romans, outside of Josephus, knew something about Qumran?
Well, just to qualify the question is who else knows about these people? So Josephus, whom we'll meet tomorrow a little bit, is a Jew who loses, his battalion in the war, and he surrenders to the Romans. And through a variety of, because he surrenders to the Romans, and he knows both Aramaic, the language of the Jews, and Greek, the language of the armies, he acts as a go-between for the Roman armies. And after the war, he set up with a pension in Rome and writes these histories about the Jews. He knows quite a bit about the people at Qumran. He knows about the Essenes. He knows about the Jews. Others also. We'll see tomorrow at the very beginning of my talk tomorrow that one of the reasons why we think this group called the Essenes is a Roman writer known as Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder, who writes a geography of the Roman world, basically goes through the land of Israel and just does like a tour. He's like a guidebook, to the different sites, and he gets down to this place called, he says, north of Ein Gedi. There's this peculiar group known as the Essenes, who don't live with any women. They only have the date palms to keep them company, and they live close to the noxious fumes of the Dead Sea. Interesting enough, he probably never had been there. He had been in the Roman army, so he'd been to a lot of these sites, but he's probably relying upon other sources, right? So we have references here and there. There are some later Roman writers that know about the Essenes. We don't know, though, how many of these writers, aside from Josephus, actually had direct kind of first-hand contact, and how many of them were relying upon second-hand testimony or even written sources. Yeah.
Were they able to tell, was each scroll written by a single individual, or was it collaborative?
So
and also, you mentioned that literacy was not that common, like a select few, but with over 900 scrolls found, do they know how many people might have been involved with writing?
This is what's the remark about the scrolls, which is so peculiar, and which also tells us why these were not just written by the people at the site of Qumran. In the 900 or so scrolls, there are probably about 600 different scribal hands. Again, so I mentioned that the way that they were able to decipher the scrolls, the chronology of the scrolls is based on the differences in development of script styles. One of the major ways that they are able to kind of put those little jigsaw puzzles back together, put these fragments in this pile, put these fragments in this pile, is not just because one copy was a copy of Genesis, so therefore they knew it was Genesis, they put it in the Genesis pile. They also had to figure out how do we distinguish between the 20 copies of Genesis. In many cases, what they found is that different scribes wrote them, right? So, you know, again, even if every one of us in this room copied out the same exact paragraph, right? And I've actually done this with students, so I can tell you that it actually works. It's a long process. We wrote out the same paragraph. We teared up all the pieces, put it in a pile. We could almost certainly reconstruct, you know, which goes to which hand. We also would have the material elements of the paper, the parchment. We'd have all these other features, you know, like water deterioration marks across, you know, lines and things like that. But the scribal hand was like the best tool that they had. Now, why are there so many scribal hands? 600 is not a lot in the kind of larger perspective of the number of literate people, professional scribes, right? But it's really remarkable if you think about the site of Qumran. It's not a very big site. There were not 600 people living there ever. At most, the high approximation is maybe 100, the low number is maybe 35, 40, right? So what they're doing is they're cultivating scrolls from all over the place. They're probably purchasing scrolls from Jericho, from Jerusalem. They're certainly writing some there. We have evidence in one particular room where there are inkwells and there are tables where they probably were writing scrolls. So we have evidence for production of scrolls. But again, this is why it's so interesting to think about this as part of the question of who these people were. They had the means to procure a large number of scrolls from outside their little site. And the scrolls themselves seem to speak of a very insular community, as we'll talk about tomorrow. But yet, there's clearly commercial activity. Otherwise, they never would be able to amass such a large collection of scrolls that were clearly from different places.
So I'm not going to be here tomorrow, unfortunately, so I'm going to try and tease out potentially a little bit of what you're going to talk about tomorrow. But my specific question is, you said they found several different scrolls of Deuteronomy, and we know there was some Isaiah. You know, were the when they found it, how do they compare to the texts that we're used to seeing or we think are the originals?
It's like you just wrote the first half of the presentation tomorrow. This is, when I talk about like major issues in Dead Sea Scroll scholarship, this is one of the biggest issues. And again, you know, I get this question a lot, and sometimes it's framed, you know, as like, is there anything like in there that we didn't know about, right? There's no big things we got wrong, right? There's no text that says, you know, there are really two gods, and, you know, all the copies of the Ten Commandments, you know, you shall believe in me and the other one, right? Nothing like that. And the truth is, when you put all the biblical scrolls together, there's the books that we now consider part of the Hebrew Bible. There's about 225 manuscripts of them, with multiple copies of some of them, like, you know, 30 copies of Deuteronomy and, you know, Isaiah and the Psalms, a lot of them. It's remarkable how close the text is to the later traditional Jewish text, the medieval text. It's really remarkable, right? Because scribes copying are very conservative in nature, right? But yet scribes are human beings. And they're human beings who, number one, make mistakes. Scribes, like modern academics, are a very, you know, they're a community of people think very highly of themselves. You know, I have some colleagues like that, right? Who, when they were copying scrolls, they didn't feel like they were just like robots, you know, like a copy machine. They oftentimes felt like they could intervene in the process of producing that story. In essence, the biblical books were not complete when these scrolls were still being copied. And we have lots of evidence of this. Again, to take the bird's eye view, you know, when you look in the collection of those 225 manuscripts, you have multiple copies of books that stand side by side and reflect a very different edition of a particular book, right? It takes 200 years or so until you get to the manuscripts that are found at Masada and then the 2nd century CE manuscripts, where you start to see the kind of stabilization towards a single text, right? So even if, let's say, 90% of the material is more or less the same, and then if we bracket off the obvious mistakes, maybe 95% is more the same. 5% is really interesting, okay? To give you one example, because you're not going to be here tomorrow, and I won't repeat this tomorrow for everybody else, we know that the book of Jeremiah existed in antiquity in 2 different versions. There's a longer version found in the medieval Hebrew text, and there's a shorter version that exists in the Greek translation known as the Septuagint. The Septuagint was a translation made in the 3rd or 2nd century BC from a Hebrew text. The Septuagint, the Greek version of Jeremiah, is a bit shorter, right? And it has a reordering of some elements, okay? Now, scholars knew about this always. They just assumed, the Greek translators took some stuff out, maybe they rearranged things, maybe they got some things wrong, maybe just things happened, right? So they are always seen as kind of distinct entities. Okay? When the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, they found 6 copies of Jeremiah. And of those 6 copies, 2 of them didn't have the content that would be overlapping. But of the 4 other ones, 2 of them looked like the longer version that matches up with the traditional Hebrew text. 2 of them looked like the shorter Septuagint Greek translation version, but in Hebrew, right? So again, these are staying side by side in the same reading community. Okay, so imagine that, right? You go into a synagogue or a church, and the clergy person says, pull out your Jeremiah, we're going to read the Word of God today. We're going to read from the man who claims to speak on behalf of God. And people are reading 2 different versions of that, right? And essentially, almost every single book of the Hebrew Bible has some variation. Some the accidental, where it's obvious that a paragraph has dropped out because of an obvious scribal error, where the I skips. And some where scribes clearly created another edition, oftentimes, centuries earlier, but both of them are being preserved side by side. And then all of a sudden, as you move into the 1st century CE, it starts to slowly stabilize into a single text, which becomes the prototype of the medieval traditional Hebrew text. That's the short answer to what we'll talk about, and we'll look at some examples of that tomorrow.
I think we'll end there.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'll be back tomorrow for more. Thank you very much.